Hello and welcome to The Current Thing with me, Nick Dixon, where we talk about politics, the culture war, and anything else that comes up. And today we have another brilliant guest, one of the finest comedians in the country, and now GB News presenter. Of course, it's Mr. Simon Evans. Thanks for doing the show, Simon.
You're very welcome, Nick. Thanks for having me.
And no exaggeration to say you are one of the country's best comedians. And how was your... And by the way, I've always said that makes you one of the best comedians in the world, since Britain is one of the foremost comedy countries. So let's just go big. Let's just go. Yeah. Why not? And how was your... Go on.
Universe, one of the greatest comedians in the universe. Probably.
Let's go there. Why not? Yeah.
Solar
Must
system,
be true.
Certainly.
All known solar systems and galaxies. You've just got back from Edinburgh, rather you than me, but I know you like the Edinburgh Festival. How was it?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of ways you could answer that. I had a good run. I got good audiences, and I made them laugh. That's the main thing. I use it always as a means. I'm in a kind of 18-month creative cycle with Edinburgh, generally speaking. I take a new show up there, which I use Edinburgh as a bit of a forge as well as a display unit. You know, it's a workshop as well as it is a showcase. The first time around, then I tour it for a year and then take it back in an absolutely glistening, perfected form. And the second time around, usually put 2.0 or something after the title to say this is the same show, but it is evolved. I mean, I find it very difficult to write a show as such. I don't know. I think that's possibly like most comedians, if they're honest, don't really write a show. It's more like it's endlessly thrown up like a pizza base, you know, and you just do it and do it and do it until it gets right. And you find if you write it, you don't remember what it was you wanted to say when you get up there. It has to be done on the hoof, you know. So it's a creative process as much as it is just a performing one. And from that point of view, I was pretty happy with it. And but I've got more performing and creativity to do over the next few months. I'm touring it over the autumn, and there's more stuff I want to bring in. I find it really interesting. I mean, it might be self-indulgent to some extent, but I find it really interesting how I think a lot like poetry, for instance. One of the things that poets have always said is that the stricter the meter and the form you're working with, like a sonnet or something, the more creative it forces you to be, you know. And Edinburgh is a lot like that. You've got an hour and you give the show a title, usually about in March, long before you have any idea what it is you're going to talk about, you know. And the more you kind of limit your choices with that title and that time and so on, the more you're forced to try and make sense of what you've committed yourself to. So I called this show Have We Met? And the intention was it was supposed to be about failing memory, but I got the title Have We Met from something that an old manager of mine in pre-comedy days used to write on leaving cards. When anyone left from the open plan office, he'd always write, "Good luck, Maureen," or whatever, "kind regards, Robin Coates, brackets, have we met?" And it always made me laugh because it was obviously a kind of, you know, a little bit of a joke at the expense of the kind of the pretense that there's this kind of great community, you know, of everyone when they come around with a leaving card. But it's turned out that my show is kind of about leaving cards to some extent as well, or sort of in a broader sense of saying farewell to certain things and recognising that certain things are passing. After 26 years in stand-up comedy, 58 years on the planet, my children are growing up. You know, lockdown was a kind of strange, frozen, suspended animation. My daughter's now off to university this autumn, and things are changing and moving on. And I'm sort of realising I'm in quite elegiac mode, but hopefully I can make that funny as well.
Okay, and it's so slightly. There is a concept, but slightly less high concept than your previous show.
Yeah, there's no huge revelation, although there are one or two smaller revelations, which I did discover during that last show, the one that you're referring to, The Work of the Devil, in which the big revelation was my discovery that I was donor conceived and that the man whose sperm donation allowed my mother to get pregnant was the single most prolific sperm donor of the modern era, as far as we know. Hundreds, if not perhaps even 1,000 children to his credit.
An absolute legend, in other words.
Yes, exactly. And it made a lot of sense of me. I found out I'm half Jewish. I found out I have, as I say, so my father, who's still alive, you know, who had, I don't know, not a particularly dysfunctional relationship with, or kind of, he was a good father, but I always felt a little bit of distance from him in a way I couldn't put my finger on, and so that's explained that. But yeah, it also explains a lot about being a stand-up comedian as well, I think, you know, which tends to be a thing arguably that's a Jewish form in itself, but perhaps more to the point, it's often people who feel they're a bit of a cuckoo in the nest who are forced into stand-up comedy. Increasingly now, of course, in Edinburgh, you see it seems to attract a lot of people who are working through gender identity or racial identity or sexual orientation or whatever, and almost to the extent that it is becoming slightly formulaic in that respect or predictable. But I think it's always been people who just didn't feel they were quite kind of a smoothly fitting part in the machine.
Makes me wonder about my parents, because of course I'm the black sheep of my family, but then I'm left-handed, I look just like my dad, got the same laugh. I mean, it's just too much there. So it's just, I think it's purely I've got the wrong, I don't know what it is with me, because it's nothing like your thing. And I think you can just be a black sheep anyway, just without such a dramatic...
You absolutely can. I mean, my wife suggested to me that I did a podcast myself which would be called So Why Are You a Stand-Up? And I would just talk to a series of stand-ups to try and unpick what it is about them. But it would always be something like that. Quite a few very well-known stand-ups, very successful stand-ups are adopted and have known that they were. Quite a few are dyslexic. I've always found that quite interesting. I think there's a higher proportion of dyslexia in stand-up comedy. And this is partly that thing. Of course, now every single stand-up has the ADHD diagnosis, but maybe dyslexia was the fashionable one 20 years ago. But I do think dyslexia is plausible because it often attaches to people who are intelligent and have things to say, but find it difficult to do so written down, you know what I mean, and through books.
Yeah.
And so stand-up becomes a means by which they can get it all out, in the same way that perhaps 20 years earlier they might have been a guitarist or something.
Well, I play guitar as well, but I certainly don't have dyslexia because I'm really good with words. But for me, maybe that's why I've left comedy. Maybe that's why I've gone into commentary. But for me, I was just funny when I was 10. I was making the whole class and the teacher laugh with quite sophisticated puns and like off the cuff stuff. And I remember like a moment of just making a great joke when I was 10 and everyone just laughing, including the teacher, and that amazing feeling. So I just think it's actually my theory is it's born in talent. And all the suffering I had later of being like spat on in secondary school and beaten up and all this kind of stuff was all unnecessary. Just to, because Jerry Seinfeld said it's just a talent and it's actually not about all this suffering.
I mean, I don't think it's suffering. Just a sense that you don't see the world quite the way everyone else does, or you're nonconformist, or you just. I mean, Ralph Waldo Emerson, great American philosopher, not a, didn't look for some excuse as to why he felt at odds with the world, but celebration of nonconformity. John Stuart Mill, celebration of nonconformity. Be eccentric. Say the thing that goes against the grain. Have the courage. Right. And of course, it takes a tiny bit less courage when you're a sort of hooded assassin in a classroom to just kind of spot the. Normally, when you get a bit of a laugh in front of the teacher or with the crowd, people say, "Well, you're the class clown," but you're not really a clown. You're more like a sniper. I always think.
Yes.
You're picking out. You're taking your moment, and that's the flaw in your argument, or that's the moment at which you have accidentally exposed yourself or another member of the teaching faculty or whatever to ridicule, and. And so, you grab that, but it doesn't have to. No, it doesn't have to be biologically rooted. It doesn't have to be a suggestion that. But I think there is a great tradition. I don't think anyone would argue that the Jews, especially in America, a huge contribution to stand-up comedy as we understand it. In this country, a lot of Celts. You would probably go look at the Scottish folk circuit for the likes of Connolly and so on. It's often slightly kind of, outside of the mainstream, and the mainstream comics are, to be honest, a little bit kind of flat and boring a lot of the time. The ones that are part of kind of light entertainment, I suppose, rather than people with any real commentary that's worth listening to. Yeah,
and so there's like two threads there. I don't want to leave all the donor. What's the official term? Donor. I don't want to get the wrong term.
Donor conceived is the word I've been told, but I mean, I don't know any better term, but I don't. Yeah. It's not like anything you say would annoy me.
Well, I have a couple of. Well, it might annoy some listeners. I have a couple of questions about that, but you've covered that so much on a different podcast I invented. I don't want to go into it too much, but I do have some questions. But then I've also got some questions on the stand-up thing. The sniper thing, by the way, is absolutely correct because that's from all my life until like. For about the first 3 decades, I thought my whole job was just to any conversation. Come in with the funny joke in the pub with family, whatever it is. That's what I thought life was. You wait, you see the opportunity, bang, you strike, you get out. It's like that's just all I thought it was, being funny. But you don't really get a chance when you're in a professional funny environment. When you're just a funny person at the pub, it's just so good with normies. It's just amazing. But
my first laugh and my first taste of enjoying being a stand-up comic was at the Comedy Store as a heckler. I can still remember it, the exact moment, and getting a massive laugh with a heckle, and it wasn't even like a particularly aggressive one. It was to be fair, the guy was weak. He was, doing his open spot or his first 10 or something, and he stumbled, and was starting to lose the crowd, and it was that puncturing moment that. But
that's
yeah,
so funny. You started as a heckler. It's like sort of starting as a victim, and then I became the perpetrator of crime. I don't know what that is.
But then I think when you're, what's his name? Ken Campbell made that documentary, and he called it the history of stand-up comedy or something, Part 1, ventriloquism, and then he never made any other parts. It was a sort of suggestion that that's all it was. But there is some truth to that. The ventriloquist dummy is like it's the integration of that. Do you know that whole thing of the breakdown of consciousness in the bicameral mind, the point at which we stop hearing voices that we think are the gods, is the origin of modern conceptions of consciousness. Anyway, it was an interesting, but probably it's a very speculative book written in the 60s, I think, by a man called Julian James about how we are to read Homer and stuff, and the extent to which people seem to think they lived in a world inhabited by gods. Well, the idea is that this is how their inner monologue seemed to them at the time. So the point is, with a ventriloquist, you've separated the straight man and the funny man within the same act, right? You've created your own double act. So you yourself are always the straight man, and the dummy says the unsayable. It's always the dummy that transgresses, never the other way around. And then when you're a stand-up, you basically have to integrate that even further. So you're your own straight man, and then your little evil devil puppet on your shoulder chips in occasionally with a. Of course, you would say that, wouldn't you? Because and you have to sort of make it a plausible internal dialogue.
Do you know what? While we're talking about obscure books and stand-up, which is two of your favourite topics, I believe, I've got a little thing here from a book called Prometheus Rising, which I think as a Christian, I think Christians would find this to be very much a pagan banned book. It's by Robert Anton Wilson, and just a book I happened to have from years ago. The reason I thought of it was when I first saw your stand-up on telly as a youngster at school. Actually, still it was on maybe Paramount Comedy or one of those things, and it was you doing your old joke about. If you're struggling to place my accent, it's actually educated was one of your famous kind of opener. Well, I'm saying famous to me, because when I saw your stand-up, Simon, I don't think anyone, particularly watching Headliners, would say Simon and Nick are the same personality, but it immediately connected with me as this is someone kind of like me. I get this. And I think it was the emphasis on writing, the kind of intellectual aspect, the kind of maybe a willingness to sort of alienate if necessary. There was a kind of outsider thing to that, and it just immediately connected with me. And the only other person that did was Stuart Francis, who was just doing one-liners, which I didn't even really understand at the time, were called one-liners. I just thought, this is good. But it was you and him, and where other people were just more performance-based, it just seemed to be jumping around to me. I was like, it didn't connect with me at all. So.
Yeah, I can see some connection with Stuart, and it's quite interesting. Funny enough, I've just written a tiny thing about Stuart today in context of I've just been beefing up a thing I wrote for Spiked during the festival about the Dave joke of the year, that weird thing that happened with the cheaters, which I'm convinced there's more than meets the eye with that. But anyway, I was saying Stuart Francis was the king of the one-liners, but also his one-liners used to then combine over the course of a set to actually create a more furnished, if you just stood back and went,
right.
Oh, okay, he's had a childhood in which his father is endlessly trying to kill him, and he's endlessly swimming back to the beach,
Yeah.
And it's a brilliant technique that to make you think it's just a one-liner, and then it turns out there's going to be a callback as well. But yeah, the willingness to alienate and to situate yourself as a superior intellect. I mean, that is in itself quite funny if you're willing to go there, but it is a high-risk strategy. Yeah, to take a high status is.
The reason it relates to the book, because otherwise it'll be a weird non sequitur that I brought that up, is Anton Wilson has this weird thing. He talks about the four humours, bilious humour, sanguinary humour, choleric humour, and phlegmatic. But then he sort of expands them, and he has a thing called hostile strength, which is he defines as I'm okay, you're not okay. And I immediately thought that's the one that Simon's doing, which is say I'm educated. Well, you were doing in the past. I'm educated, you're not. Or you talk about Newcastle and they got the joke eventually. One of them got the joke, passed it around, that kind of thing. It was winter up there, had been for years, all that kind of thing. And you're saying I'm smart and brilliant, and you lot are kind of yahoos to some extent. And and then there was one that was hostile weakness, and I immediately thought that's exactly what I'm doing, which he defines as I'm not okay, you're not okay, and that's what I was always doing with stand-up. Is I'll attack myself and everyone else. So I am going to attack the venue, I am going to attack the city, and me as well brutally, and then he's got sanguinary or friendly strength. I'm okay, you're okay, which I thought was pure McIntyre. Aren't we having a great time? I'm ultra confident, but everything's great. And then it was like and then it was friendly weakness, which is I'm not okay, you're okay. I'm not sure who that is. Perhaps a kind of Lee Evans. That's a kind of just sort of kind of total sort of loser character, which quite a lot of comedians do play actually, like a kind of I'm a pathetic loser and helpless in the world.
Daniel Kitson had very, very low status in some regards. Remember, I don't know if you've seen him, he sort of went off the circuit and went private, and just, he's made a very good business model just through having people who understand themselves to be, part of a cult. But he used to shuffle on stage genuinely looking like a kind of paedophile, like an old-fashioned park-based, van-based paedophile with thick glasses and greasy hair and everything. And yet it was deceptive because even though he was obviously one of life's losers, there was no question he was absolutely one of life's losers, and yet somehow he still made you feel like he'd got one over on you. It wasn't apologetic. I don't know if anyone can really be that friendly weak thing that
maybe he'd be in hostile
that is
weakness
like a dog
like me
that wants to get beaten. It's not funny. You won't laugh at that, I don't think.
I think maybe like a character in a movie, a sort of a Norman Wisdom type character, maybe someone like that.
Yeah, possibly.
Am I thinking of the right guy? A sort of Frank Spencer, possibly. I'm not sure. Anyway, I just thought that just struck me as a kind of obscure thing to mention. But
no, it's interesting. Yeah.
But you started with that, and then you it connected with me immediately. But then you moved, you softened a bit with your persona and kind of became just more sort of rounded. Would you say that's true? Sort of just more who you are?
I think, there is that. Certainly, it's tiring to sustain a very sort of high concept and false paradigm. And I hadn't really gone into stand-up intending to create this arrogant character. It just seemed to chime with people. You try a few different things out and you notice what the audience go, yes, that's you, It's a lot in the early days. A lot of it is down to listening and to seeing what plays well. I remember this is slightly unnerving, but I remember watching Jordan Peterson only a couple of years ago, who, of course, you will now do the brilliant impression of, who said in one of his old, when he used to do his talks from his lecture rooms in Toronto University, I think it was, that he believed that most of the world's great orators, that's how they start out. Like if when Hitler in the 1930s. Who is so closely associated now with anti-Semitism that you would think it was his driving force and it was motivating him to do everything. But in Peterson's view, he suspects that actually he probably tried that out among a few other things when he was making his early speeches, in upstairs in pubs in downtown Munich. And he noticed that seemed to get everyone's attention. Every time you mention the Jews, people start going, yeah, that's right, the Jews, isn't it? And so you sort of bring that forward in the routine, and there.
Are you saying that was just material that worked? This is the material that worked. It's so hard to write new material.
Exactly. You just go, I'll do some more stuff about the, and there is an element of that. And I think in my sets contain things that I wasn't sure that I would, that I wanted to talk about, but they immediately chime. And I think to some extent the idea that I was, educated and from the upper classes, but it isn't true at all. I'm not privately educated, and anyway, I think the decisive moment, to be honest, was when we moved to when we had kids and then moved down to the coast, down to Brighton and Hove, and I started to feel like a beleaguered dad then at that point. It was quite a different mode generally that I was in as well, having enjoyed bachelorhood well into my mid-30s, I was suddenly overburdened with responsibilities of one kind or another, and it just didn't seem plausible anymore to write kind of,
high status.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, I'd made as many mistakes as the next man.
Right. When you're in there with the nappies, you're like, I'm superior. Yeah, I see your point. And so you did sort of, and you sort of your delivery became a bit more sort of long form. And then you changed to your classic opener, this is all very well, but where are his eyes? And I've told you about that before. I've explained to you the genius of your own joke, which I'm sure you're well aware of, which is the line, this is all very well, which is just so Simon Evans. And other people have misquoted it. And I'm like, no, you've misquoted it. It's this is all very well, but which is just such an extremely funny way of putting it. As if the audience is sitting there going, this is all very well. It's just an arcane, polite, 1920s, absurd way of putting it, but it's so perfect. Anyway,
I had a few phrases like that I think they maybe came from Alan Coren. I'm not sure his ability to just drop it, or maybe Woodhouse. I don't know. There's obviously a handful of universally revered comedy prose writers. There was one in an earlier bit of material about the homeless in King's Cross. I think was very early material when I used to live up there, about saying a lot of homeless in King's Cross. It's terribly sad, and so on and so forth. And it was the so on and so forth
yeah.
again, you know, dismissing any kind of. I'm not going to go into any more details about the sympathy that they're due, but still, one can't help but feel. You know.
Yeah, you're so. I mean, I could quote your lines all day like an absolute fanboy, but I loved your one about your dad. You were talking about ergonomic gardening tools and how it's all got ridiculously advanced. So you said it wasn't like that, Ben. Most of his tools still had German blood on them, which I thought was one of the all-time great lines. I mean, and you had your, by the way, lastly on nerding out about your comedy, the diving watch joke is one of the greatest jokes because in terms of tags, which if the listener doesn't know is when you add an additional joke to the joke, your diving watch joke has the most excellent repeated
3 tags. Yeah,
so
I think
good.
3 is about as far as you can go, isn't it? Before it's.
I've gone 4, Simon, but it's not for everyone. No, I don't have no idea. Everyone should look up that as well because I don't want to badly quote it now, but it's probably, I'm sure it's still on YouTube or something. But I got so into comedy nerd stuff, but when you said that comedians are an outsider traditionally,
I just want to say on that my great influence or like the lodestone or whatever for the tagging thing, which is once you've established a comedy principle, just like giving it a little twist and each time, is got to be Woody Allen's Moose routine, which there are like almost single word tags in certain sections of there, like the Moose does well, mingles, scores, you know.
Yeah.
Each word is just like, oh my God, it's genius. It's like turning like a slalom, you know, at high speed. Amazing.
Yeah. And that was my other big thing growing up, listening to the Woody Allen stand-up, whatever it was called, that stand-up CD he had, which was so good. You know, I was more influenced by the comedy than his personal life. But yeah, that was another big influence for me. But anyway, I've semi-stopped comedy, so who cares about me? But when you say the comedian's an outsider, you did mention it briefly saying Billy Connolly was, but others were a bit boring. Isn't that the big problem now in comedy, that they're not outsiders, they're weird conformist activists who aren't even comedians? It's all about groupthink and towing the line with, you know, we could say wokeness or whatever word that people think we say on GB, but it's destroyed the whole meaning of the comedian, the whole purpose.
Yeah, I don't know necessarily whether it's. I mean, it could be that these things have happened side by side, or it could be that one has influenced the other. I think possibly as much as wokeness or a certain kind of superficially outsider status, which is actually so thoroughly endorsed by woke capital and what have you, that, you know, people like us roll our eyes at it and going, you think you're a rebel, you think you're the you're the outsider, and in reality the establishment couldn't be more thoroughly on your side, you know. But I do think also it's just the way that almost any creative industry, you know, will flower over the course of, I don't know, was it like I started in 96, 97, and I was looking earlier, you know, when I was up in Edinburgh, looking back to the Perrier shortlist in 97 was Milton Jones, Al Murray, Graham Norton, Johnny Vegas, and the League of Gentlemen. I mean, just an incredible, you know, a fistful of talent there, that every single one of those people went on to have a significant impact. But every single one of those people inspires 5 new people. Every single one of those people inspires 5. And before you know it, it's a bit like every year in the garden, if you plant like rosemary or lavender, by the end of the year, you've got this horrible tangled mess of sort of gnarly, undifferentiated shrubbery that needs uprooting and starting again. And I kind of feel we're at that point with comedy. It's not that they're not like, excuse me, it's not that they're deliberately groupthink or you know, subject, you know, cautious or anxious not to transgress social norms or whatever. It's just that there's too many of them. There are just too many people, and there are only a certain number of things that anyone can meaningfully say or do that's funny in society at any given point. And when there's just too many clamouring, it becomes, you know, the Life of Brian thing. We are all individuals. I'm not, you know. We're in that state at the moment, I'm afraid.
Interesting. And the fact that there are too many could mean, because comedy is famously, some people will know it was kind of booming in the 90s, and in the clubs you could make a lot of money. And then suddenly you couldn't. I never saw that phase starting in 2011, but I was constantly told about the old days by the circuit people. So it was all like, but the competition for work, when there's not as much work to go around, probably makes people more afraid and more prone to groupthink and just staying within the, you know, how do I get my agent? How will I get on telly? Do you think?
Yeah. You're probably familiar with the term elite overproduction generally as a sort of analysis of society. Maybe not. It's like an idea It's an idea that it's a very dangerous thing that happens, and that we probably are in the midst of right now, where too many people, the elite, people who expect themselves to be qualified and entitled to become part of the elite, but there's too many of them. So if you have too many graduates, is the most obvious example in the modern world. Too many people come out of university burdened with enormous debt, and assuming that their degree will at the very least ensure that they can, earn good money and pay it off, and they find it's not, and it's worthless, and it creates an extraordinary amount of dissatisfaction, and an awful lot of the sort of politics that arises from the young at the moment is arguably, stems in that. In the late 19th century, I think it was, in China, something called the Taiping Rebellion was tagged to that, which was, absolutely murderous, like off the scale bloodshed, which incredibly came because the route to prosperity in China at that time was believed to be getting your children into the civil service exams, and then more and more people studied for the civil service exams, and then like 1 in 10 and then 1 in 100 were taken because there were far too many, and it just created this class of people who were just furious that their future had been denied them. I mean, on a much smaller scale, in stand-up comedy, there are probably just like a lot of, we're at the stage where there's just more fear, and so there is, yes, I will try and be palatable. I will try not and frighten the horses. I will try to make myself as usable in as many different formats possibly. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the mindset is of the people, but it would be understandable if that were the case. Desperately hoping to get on live at the Apollo, the last thing you want to do is say something disobliging, that would scupper that for you, such as express your support for Graham Linehan or something.
Yeah.
So, it can happen. But equally, of course, they might be thinking, I've got to find some way of marking myself out. But obviously, there are also other forms in which creative people are working now. It may well be that anyone whose mind and talent and instincts might have drawn them to stand-up comedy in the mid-90s might now be looking at, I don't know, games production or just simply TikTok or something, in which to flourish and not regard stand-up comedy as a route to anything they were interested in anyway. So It may just be that we're missing that. I don't know.
Well, yeah, and I've done it within my own, just myself. I mean, I'm 2 separate generations within one person, because I've done comedy for 11 years, then decided this is going nowhere. I'm not allowed to progress in this field anymore with my immutable characteristics. Haters would say I'm just not good enough, or it's just not appealing to me anymore. So then I've moved into more commentary. So the younger generation will move, and some people like me will move, within their own lifetime. Whereas you've sort of occupied a position of, I don't know, because you've been going a long time, maybe. Well, I don't know what I can ask you about that. How have you maintained your status of acceptance in the comedy world and appearing on GB News while having sound opinions that should normally get you in trouble? An almost Norcottian level of fence-sitting acceptance. But, it's incredible. I think it's because I would posit it's probably because you've been going so long and you've got so much respect that people just sort of, well, that's Simon, we'll give him a pass. Whereas for someone like, let's say, me and Leo, we've sort of run headfirst into the politics of the comedy industry and had to just go and do these other things. He still does comedy and I do occasional bits, but you managed to maintain both.
Well, I mean, I don't do the clubs very often. I think the venues that book me, this, reason 300 seat venues when I go on tour, just know that I have an audience, and most of them are around my age. And we all know half the country agrees with the stuff that you won't hear anything about in the clubs. So they're not that bothered about that particularly. I'm still on the news quiz with Radio 4, and I think the Simon Evans Goes to Market series probably helped in terms of maintaining a sort of legitimacy and credibility. But yeah, I mean, I make sure that I think when I host the headliners on GB News that I am doing it as me, and one of the great things about that show, and when I spoke to Andrew Doyle about, when he first approached me, was that, I'm not going to be like a kind of wearing a little kind of Union Jack bowler hat or something, while I'm going on there. It's obviously got to be a platform in which we can maintain our own artistic integrity, for want of a better word, and I hope I've done that. So if anything got out, if any clips got out of me saying something that was cancelable, that might still be damaging, but I don't think I would say that, because I don't generally think those things, that are, the full strength kind of culture wars unacceptability. Even on Spiked, which I know a lot of people think of as a title that cultivates division, I generally think if people actually read the stuff I write, it generally keeps it quite light, and most of my flashes of real anger are directed more at, the culture of the College of Policing, or the weakness of the Tory government in failing to commit to its manifesto pledges and so on, rather than directed at marginalised members of society or whatever. So, I think generally speaking, anyone who looks into what I'm doing will see that it's not divisive, hopefully. I honestly do think I would much rather take the heat out of the situation and remind people that we're not here for long, and let's try and have a laugh.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're a liberal Remainer who lives in Brighton, so you're not exactly the caricature. I mean, and I don't think I am either, personally. I think that, some people might think me and Leo want to make the show some sort of alt-right fest, but actually I personally think my opinions are nuanced and subtle, and not just not just textbook, and I think a lot of the channels like that, if people actually watch it, especially our little comedy bit.
I think the thing that I'm very interested in some of the stuff that you've said about the pandemic. I think broke an awful lot of people who just couldn't believe that the extraordinary in the degree to which our government embraced, the Chinese government's approach to lockdown and so on, and the extraordinary transfer of wealth into the hands of a handful of billionaires, and the ever growing power of the big pharmaceutical companies in America to dominate the conversation and to have their propaganda accepted as the as the consensus, and any deviation from it as misinformation. All of that kind of stuff. I don't regard that as necessarily a left-right divide or anything anyone should be cancelled over. It's just a very difficult territory, because you have to walk a narrow path with slippery slopes on both sides, if you know what I mean. And that, I think, is I think that's a job that comedians should be doing. It's a job that people like George Carlin, or Bill Hicks, or Lenny Bruce, or whatever, the great heroes of comedy in the past would certainly have gone there. And yet now an awful lot of comedians seem to think that is conspiracy theory, anti-Semitism, and frightening.
Yes, and I mean, I lost the connection slightly, just as it seemed as you were about to give me a compliment, which was frustrating. But I think it will be on the recording. But you were just talking about I've taken a anti sort of COVID authoritarianism view.
Yeah,
and exactly. And I said something to Dara O'Brien on Twitter referencing Bill Hicks, and he wrote some reply that was looks mean, so I didn't read it. But the fact that Bill Hicks would be loved by many sort of lefty type comedians, but now his clips will be played on InfoWars as part of one of their montages, and fits in quite nicely. You see where Bill Hicks would have been. I'm not saying it had necessarily been on InfoWars with Alex Jones, but he certainly wouldn't have been a lefty establishment comedian. There's no chance.
He could very easily have been on InfoWars, funnily enough. I mean, and some of his stuff I always found at the time, that's a bit ridiculous, but I accepted it as playing it for laughs. But I mean, he genuinely believed in the most outrageous Kennedy assassination scenarios, didn't he? I think, and also UFOs as well. So
Yeah, well, Kennedy's looking more and more correct on, but maybe that's another rabbit hole. But did COVID change your outlook in terms of, we've had James Delingpole on here. It certainly changed his outlook, and certainly a lot of people became more red-pilled, which could go in two directions. I mean, they could become just more sort of politically red-pilled, reactionary or something like that, but it could also go down conspiracy rabbit holes, which I don't particularly see you doing. And some people became more spiritual. They realized there's a battle of good versus evil, they even took it down to, and they became Christian, some of my friends. So did that whole COVID era and the bizarre things that happened change your outlook?
It did, although I'm not sure in any of the ways you mentioned. I know I do have some friends I stay in touch with who have like Delingpole adjacent views, and I don't share them or share them all, but I like to keep those people on side. I like to just kind of, basically I let a few balls whiz past me. You have a WhatsApp conversation with people, and every so often they'll share something and you just go, I'm just going to let that go whistling past, and then we're back to joking about it. But I keep an eye on it. I mean, it's sometimes dangerous, isn't it, to say I keep an open mind. People say I keep an open mind about 9/11. You know, that can easily translate into, for instance, it might have been the Jews. Well, I don't think it was, but what I do think with COVID is that it exposed some of the sentiments, some of the weaknesses, some of the priorities of government and so on in a way that I didn't find terribly reassuring. It exposed where true power lies. It exposed the extent to which there's always the law of unintended consequences, and this happens a lot, and you see that if somebody presents a certain kind of program or response the wrong way at the wrong moment, the reaction to it can be so powerful and overwhelming that it becomes impossible even to suggest again a second time, even though it was perfectly sensible. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't know whether that is the case, but I still think to this day we'd have been better going down a broadly speaking sort of Swedish route. But I think the very fact that we had Boris Johnson in charge, who was probably exactly the sort of person that a lot of people felt was most likely to just shrug and say, let's take it on the chin, just because he was lazy, rather than because it was actually the best thing to do, and consequently it became an unpursuable policy precisely because it was one that just smacked so much of Johnson's well-established character flaws,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So, it was a weird time. To come straight out Brexit, then that huge Tory majority in December 2019, the Red Wall budget, a couple of weeks later, we just seemed to be entering such a very specific kind of quite unexpected, Tory government agenda, and then for that to arrive at that moment, I think it just disorientated everyone. And so I don't generally think it red-pilled me or black-pilled me about who's really running the world or anything, but it was disorientating, certainly. I generally think that the vaccines were developed absolutely with everyone's best interest, with the proper moral and professional responsibility and so on code. Inevitably, they aren't going to be perfect. Some people have been, I suspect, hurt by them, but overall, I'm pretty convinced that they saved lives and allowed us to restore normality to some extent. So I'm overwhelmingly in favour of them. I know there are particular issues you could unpick there, but that's broadly my feeling about those. Okay. The extent to which we need endless boosters, or that we should ever think about masking up and locking down again, I'm very much more dubious about that.
Well, it's a good thing we waited till nearly 40 minutes, because you may have just alienated a huge section of my audience. But no, of course you can have your view on the vaccines. And I don't know what the current status of YouTube is. So with Dr. Claire Craig, we were calling it the safe and effective treatment. And it's a pure blood podcast you're on here, Simon. But that's your view, and that's fair enough. On the conspiracy side, you mentioned the potential links with anti-Semitism. People, some people think that, like, for example, they listen to Delingpole, they think some of his theories are anti-Semitic. I've never seen that at all. I don't believe that. But have you become more sensitive to that with this revelation that you're actually biologically Jewish? Has that changed things like that for you?
It's been interesting just in this one respect. I don't feel any more sensitive when I see possible anti-Semitism or accusations of it one way or another. I think that would be sort of dishonest somehow. But two of my very best friends are Jewish, and I feel like my ability to talk with them about, is this anti-Semitic, was that anti-Semitic, I feel like I'm in slightly more comfortable sort of inner circle conversations, and that's quite interesting. Yeah. For instance, among those friends, broadly speaking, their opinion is that most of the accusations of anti-Semitism aimed at Corbyn and his cabinet and party and so on were unjustified, and that it was weaponized. As I say, it's not that I have that view, but it's interesting to have that conversation with those people, and I know other people have strongly alternative views to that. But it is quite interesting to get that kind of conversation, I suppose, as I say, from the inside to some extent. But
because that's quite funny. They're sort of saying, "Oh, you wouldn't get this, Simon. You're not Jewish. Look at this certificate," and you've just found out. Exactly. I think you're fine, guys. I'm in the club now. That's amazing.
But it's not like a slam dunk at all. As I say, all I mean is we both know, there are Jews on both sides. There are plenty of Jews who think that that Corbyn was slandered. Or was at worst, lazy or incautious in not putting down and not being decisive enough. But I still don't have any very strong or well-informed views about Israel or whatever. So that would be, I haven't changed very much on that. The view that I do have, which is perhaps even more unpalatable than all of that, but I've always felt it, is that it does suggest to me that there is something that it means to be Jewish fundamentally, because I think, always felt somehow subconsciously a bit Jewish. My best friend at school was pretty much the only other Jewish boy in the class. He was my best man at my wedding. This is not like I've retroactively identified him as a friend. He's been my best mate for over 40 years now. Pretty much my best mate from university, also Jewish, and this was at a time when I had no idea that I was Jewish, and it just sort of feels to me like I don't know how it works exactly, what enormously complex cluster of genes might suggest a certain sort of Jewish personality. But of course, if you extrapolate that out, that is essentially a kind of racism. Basically, you're saying race does have a fundamental, it has a meaning. It's not necessarily that some races deserve more hostility or to be feared or respected or liked or admired or whatever, just that it is a meaningful thing. And that has been interesting, because that was probably a question that I felt more ambivalent about previously, and I suspect I'm somewhat more hereditarian now.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And maybe, in case we didn't explain it properly, you found out biologically your father was Jewish. And so, of course, culturally it's matrilineal. So I suppose in some sense it wouldn't make you Jewish, but in another sense it would. And the idea of it being hereditary or genetic is fascinating. But like you say, it does open a lot of tricky doors, potentially things like IQ and all those kind of things. And people who open those doors don't last on YouTube very long, so maybe won't go down that route. But yeah, it does open some interesting questions. One question they didn't ask on trigonometry about it is, wouldn't it have been strange if you were, I think you're probably somewhat of an atheist, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if you'd have been like a devout Christian, or something like that, wouldn't it have been very strange to find out you were Jewish?
Yes, it certainly would have done. I'm not devout Christian or devout anything else, and I've always had a fairly open mind about spirituality and paths to awakening and so on. And I'm still open and still seeking. I find that stuff very interesting. I'm quite interested at the moment in a guy who talks on YouTube. I can't remember his name, but he talks about analytic idealism, essentially. But the idea that consciousness is the fundamental reality of the universe in which we all live. And I think you can map that onto different religions and so on. So I'm interested in all of that, and that hasn't proved problematic in that respect. My biological father, for what it's worth, was very much secular, and I don't think there's any. And of my Jewish friends, they're pretty secular. But one or two things I do quite like about Jewish tradition rather than religion. The Friday night dinner, the keeping the family close, the sense of being a knitted together community in a hostile, sometimes in a hostile land. There are aspects of that I would quite like to adopt. I sometimes wish I had.
I think you just described Northerners to me. But that is interesting that it's. Well, it's good to get the dinners, I suppose. But it's changed. It would have been extra. It must have been a strange revelation anyway. Obviously, to suddenly find out your background is completely different. And you've dealt with that on other podcasts, and it's obviously a massive thing. I just thought there'd be an extra layer if it also affected your sort of fundamental religious views, an extra level. But yeah.
Well, I mean, without obviously, it's a bit pat to say so, but Jesus was a Jew, and it's not a. If to the extent that I think hereditarian principles are raised, that wouldn't clash with it particularly. It would be like, what do you do with this information? I suppose, yeah. Yeah,
no, just another potential complexity, but you haven't faced that one. But so, I mean, there's so many things I want to ask you about the wider cultural stuff, and I don't know which way to go, because there's also masculinity. You found I was shocked that you were taking testosterone. I found out that you had low test, because I actually got a testosterone test just out of interest. Mine was just really high. It was like higher than a lot of like young fitness YouTubers. Excellent. I was like, I'm smashing it. But it was decent. It wasn't. I've got carried away. It was moderate. It was solid. You know what I mean? But you shock. I would never have had you down as someone with low testosterone. Although it does make sense now that you would have. You've been taking.
2017, I don't know how long it had been low, but I got the blood test because I was feeling rubbish. So I think I'd gone for about 6 months with just feeling very low energy, low focus, inability to make decisions, that kind of thing, and just not equal to the day generally, just real kind of want to lie in bed. Something quite similar to depression, but more like a fog than a bad mood. So that suggests to me it hadn't been that low for that long, because that was what I was seeking some kind of answer to. And I suspected actually it might be testosterone, because I had read quite a lot online about this kind of, half the Western world is low in testosterone due to all kind of endocrine disruptors, as you know from Alex Jones turning the frogs gay and so on. So it's that's widely attested. How long it's been going on, I don't know, but I do also remember I have another friend who told me that he had his approach had been not to take injections. He was a bit younger when he found out, and he started getting boxing lessons, and he said fighting is the best way to get it restored healthily, naturally, and for as long as you can. But and he was looking great. I remember having that conversation with him and really registering, he had a bit of a glint in his eye, which hadn't been there for a while, And he said it's actually, to some extent, it's getting hit incredibly that actually restores your health as much as being fit or whatever, or lifting weights. You actually need to feel, I'm under attack. What am I going to do? You need that on a regular basis. And his view, which again I think sounds pretty plausible, is that it's domestic life which lowers men's testosterone as much as all the plastics and the stuff in the meat or the water supply, whatever. It's just being surrounded by domesticity, a wife, small children, that nature wants your testosterone to go down, because it lowers your tendency to take risks. It certainly lowers your tendency to seek sexual gratification elsewhere, And so, the world has selected for that over the years. So I think that might be why yours is still high, because you don't have to put up with that, and you constantly feel under attack. As soon as you start to feel cozy and put your feet up, that's when it happens.
Yeah, and I don't have the domesticity, which is said to lower it from new fathers and so on. Women's tears lowered it temporarily. The getting hit thing's funny, because I've just started boxing lessons, and I was saying to Guy, you can hit me if you want, so I think you have to pay a bit more to get a man to come to your house and hit you. It was more footwork, so it was more like the basics. But I'm just like, I must have sensed it. I was like, I don't mind getting hit. So I was like, that's Fight Club, isn't it? In a nutshell, I mean, that's what it was all about, the movie Fight Club.
Absolutely, but I've never had boxing training, but I do remember on a handful of occasions, often funnily enough in Edinburgh, possibly because there's a little thing in Edinburgh, if you get involved in the wrong altercation with an English accent during festival, when some of the locals are feeling invaded, I think I've taken a blow 3 or 4 times to the head.
Wow.
Not like knocked over, but cuffed possibly even, if you were to slow it down, but enough to feel whoa. And it's like, I don't know exactly how to say it, but it's quite energizing. It feels quite good. There's a part of it. It's not something you can. It's a bit like a cold shower or whatever. It's a good, but it wakes you up. You get a ringing in the ears, and then you're immediately awake and you're on your toes. And yeah, it's not a bad feeling at all. But as I say, I think once you're in your 50s, you cannot afford. I couldn't afford at this point really to take the risk of getting regular blows to the head. So
no, yeah, that's my concern, because I sort of need my brain for my work. I have been in one street fight up in Newcastle where loads of lads, teenagers really, but we were barely out of being teenagers, were attacking my mate. So I dived in to stop them as a diversion, got punched in the face. I was more of a diversion. Yeah. That was my got punched in the face, and we got out of there. And a couple of blows myself. Happy. Main thing was I realised I wasn't a coward, at least in that situation. So I was happy about that.
Yeah.
But has it changed this testosterone you take now? Then has it changed you? Do you start watching a lot more Andrew Tate videos? I mean, it must have made a difference.
It definitely did change me in terms of it. It got rid of that terrible feeling of. And what's it called? Anhedonia, is it, when you just can't find joy in anything? It was a kind of it got me out of that trough. But I haven't become like absurdly masculine again. No, I'm not like priapic or anything. There's no sort of sense of being sort of raised above what you would expect. I mean, I've just been restored roughly to what a 58-year-old man historically should be like. It's just that most of us, an awful lot of us, are currently. I had at that point the testosterone levels that would normally have been associated with an 85-year-old man, historically. And that is just not good enough. You just don't feel equal to. And obviously on stage, you need a certain amount of aggression as well, especially, as you say, if you're going down the Prometheus Rising stage group one category of comedy. If you're willing to take the fight to the audience, you've got to be a little bit, you've got to be assertive. And it's restored that.
They did a test, I think, on some people from BuzzFeed or one of those type of journals, and it turned out they had all had the testosterone of 80-year-olds, and they were like in their 20s and things. This is where we are now. Even my allegedly solid testosterone I'm boasting about would be laughed at by an 18th century farmer. As you say, it's all gone well down. But on this topic, just briefly, a kind of related topic is, you talked a little bit on some of the podcasts about marriage and things, and this sort of, I'm not sure what my question is yet, but it's sort of masculinity and marriage. We've got the collapse of marriage, we've got the collapse of the birth rate, we've got men in crisis, we've got incels. Do you have sort of any take on that, about how the young men or men in general can sort of get out of this problem? Because I had a funny comparison. See what you think to this, because you have so much historical knowledge. I said that men now, I have friends who are saying, look, we've got to bring men and women together again. They might be traditional, they might be sort of not very feminist, they don't like all that stuff, but they say, but men need to get on board as well, and they need to stop being red-pilled and obnoxious, and they shouldn't be like Andrew Tate and stuff. And I say, well, men are so alienated now, and so beaten down and crushed and abused by, and discriminated against and abused by the society and our Western culture. We're like Germany after the First World War, where we're so humiliated and angry that we're not actually ready to just make peace yet. We're more on like our Hitler phase, and we're sort of getting cultural revenge, if anything, through things like, Red Pill, through the popularity of Tate. I like Andrew Tate, but, through things like that. What do you think?
Yeah, it's such a multivariate problem. Obviously, there are important serious speakers across the spectrum. Well, not across the spectrum, on the right, addressing it. I'm more Peterson than Tate, in terms of telling young men to take responsibility, get the fundamentals right, and trust the process, and I wouldn't recommend that young men regard women as the enemy, or regard them as, there's a sort of sense in some of the content that it's like how to train a dog. You have to assert that you're master and don't get sentimental about it. The dog will love you the more if it knows what your relationship is, and that it needs permission to get on the sofa. There's a little bit of a tang of that, I think, to some of that advice. But it's so much. I honestly do think the endocrine disruptors are having an effect. I do think that. I think there's, I don't think you can turn around your life or your determination to build a family and to take on the responsibilities of a career and the general burden. If you're physically being compromised by the environment you live in, and that's not easy for people to get around. There's a guy I know who produces. He produces kind of software for online trainers, personal trainers, to use it, but he makes interesting videos himself. And he did one where he spent a fortnight trying to eliminate xenoestrogens from his own sort of diet, whether it be plastic water bottles or whatever. And he just said it was so incredibly hard, and even then he didn't manage to make much of an impact. And he's like a 32-year-old fit, relatively built guy. But it is tricky. That particular aspect of things, I don't think you can underestimate it. But I would hope there is some kind of cyclical thing where we might be kind of already bottoming out in terms of the going their own way kind of thing. I think my kids are 19 and 16. I think my son and his mates are actually pretty traditionally male. I get that feeling in a way that even my daughter, only 4 years older, I saw a lot of more of her kind of gang being a little bit sort of asexual about, and I'm just thinking, I'd rather not get involved with all of that. Sounds a bit too complicated to me. So I don't know, but God knows, you could pick anything. Like the availability of online pornography is obviously a massive debate. Whether that, and I haven't had that conversation with my kids yet, but it must have a huge impact, right? If you can get stuff that's so vivid and so effective, basically, just on your phone all the time, that eliminates a huge part of the motivation to put up with the bother of courting, doesn't it? In the traditional sense,
Yeah, and exactly. And you even said on another podcast that you even thought religion was to an extent intended to drive fertility, which some of our Christian audience might not like, but I suppose it's not that controversial. It encourages marriage. It encourages lots of societal structures that are helpful.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it until the last year or so, but I think that's true, and especially obviously the Catholic Church. But I think generally what we hadn't previously realised was how much of a, I mean, it would just select for that, and that's how it would grow. But yes, it has become more and more obvious that people are actually not as inclined to have loads of babies as we'd previously thought. If
I know it's a bit of a problem.
Individualism. Yeah.
I've never gone down the endocrine disruptors path, because then you go a bit mad, don't you? It's like, bro, you're using shower gel, you're drinking tap water. Do you hate yourself? Like, I was like, I can't. It's too much. But interesting.
Exactly, I mean, right. That's the thing. There are 30 or 40 of them. It's not like, all you have to do is give up seed oils. Although, to be honest, even if you're trying to give up seed oils, you'd be amazed how many products they're in. So, I mean,
yeah, I'm going for the more spiritual approach to it, conquer it that way. But just quickly then, I always ask like two questions.
I would say get a big blonde wig. Of course, that's another massive boost.
That's
self-esteem.
Yeah.
The blonde beast.
What about this question? I always ask about. I always say, is Britain or sometimes England finished? Which is a big question. Loads of people think the country is just in massive decline. You seem slightly more optimistic when I've spoken to you about this.
Well, I think the whole of the West is going through horrible spasms of post-COVID. The tax burden is high. There's a general kind of feeling of defeatism. We've been battered by. Even if you were pro-Brexit, you can't be happy with the way Brexit has been handled. And if you were against Brexit, all your worst nightmares appear to be unfolding in front of you. There's so many things to feel down about, but that won't, I think, be forever. I think there'll be, in fact, I suspect possibly, the Tories are rarely quite as stupid as they appear to be, and I suspect they might be able to pull a few levers in 10 months' time to prepare us for the next election that suddenly release a bit of cash into the economy. It's absurd, but we live in a capitalist world, and the reality is 2% growth makes all the difference, and 1% shrinkage just makes you feel like you're going down the plug hole. Whether or not we're exactly in recession, certainly the amount of inflation we've had and everything, these are superficial things. I know it's not answering the question you've asked about Britain in terminal decline, but it can give you that vibe. It's a bit like, is your marriage in trouble? Well, a lot of that might just literally be the row you had last night. And if the other person comes and says sorry, everything suddenly feels rosy again, So I would say Britain. I mean, it has had its best days. Clearly, it's had its. I mean, it had. God, it probably had the best days that any country has ever had, didn't it? In terms of status worldwide and the legacy it's left, and we are benefiting. On the one hand, we're not held in the same esteem we were, and a lot of the the changes and decline. When you think, my God, we used to be the greatest power in the world, and now look at us. But on the other hand, we are all enjoying the benefits of the slow slide from that situation. So it's probably still, it's a weird thing. I know philosophers have said, a lot of philosophers have said that the greatest pleasure. I think was it Nietzsche said this, that the definition of pleasure is the sense of becoming. In coming into one's full potential, that's where, and it is hard to feel that in Britain at the moment. I think the direction of travel throughout my whole life has been managed decline. We had a surge during Thatcher that was really about North Sea oil, and I don't know whether we'll ever have that again. But there are places where you can look and see more positive signs than the ones that tend to dominate. There are certain sectors where we are still pretty strong. I think, generally speaking, we are still, obviously, a destination for a lot of migrants, which we may feel ambivalent about welcoming. But, however ambivalent many of us might feel about mass immigration on this scale, let alone, undocumented coming across the channel on small boats and so on, it does at least suggest that the country is not completely screwed yet, because it's a place where a lot of people still want to live. But I think if we can get some easing on the tax burden, some productivity gains. I mean, these are fairly boring economic issues, but I think they will change people's general perception a lot more than we might think. there is a human tendency when things go wrong to feel the game is up. I know it myself. If I wake up, with a bad back or a crook neck or something, I just start to go, oh my God, you're a crock, You're never going to be healthy and happy again. But actually, a little bit of exercise and some stretches and so on, and you get back on your feet. So, yeah, I still think it's a pretty good place to live on the whole. We have a glorious countryside. We have some of the most beautiful old buildings in the world. It would be lovely to see things. I think things that would really help restore confidence would be, I go against my general grain, which is usually free market rather than command economy, but I do think perhaps we need a coordinated effort to understand how to reinvent town centres, high streets, the built environment that people live in can have a hugely depressive effect on mood and positivity if it's allowed to just fall into ruin and disrepair. And one thing you see as a stand-up comedian when you tour the country is the rubbish state a lot of small to medium-sized erstwhile market towns have fallen into, a lot of boarded up shops, a lot of arcades and pound shops and so on. And I mean, reality is, internet and so on have eaten into the profitability of retail. I think it would be quite nice to see a coordinated effort to try and restore some pride and appeal to town centres and get people coming together again in community. That's a thing that we've always been good at, Britain, historically. I think people have had grassroots communities, whether it be pubs or working men's clubs or whatever, or church, and we're in a bit of a dip on that front at the moment. I think that's something that would restore a lot of optimism.
Yeah, those kind of projects that Roger Scruton was working on, this beauty and this unnecessary immiseration of the brutalist architecture and so on. Yeah, that's certainly an area that could be addressed. But I mean, I'm surprised how optimistic you are, because it's someone like me. I look at cost of living, housing, immigration, decline of Christianity, wokeness, racial tension. One could go on and on, but small boats. You can go on and on. I mean, to me, the whole thing, authoritarianism post-COVID across the West, and we could go on and on about how, I don't know. I just tend to, loads of people now just have this sense that it's kind of over, but it's good that you don't feel quite as bad as that. And on some of those notes, my other question I like to ask is, how do we win? And you might not accept the framing of the question, but if we're in a culture war, how do we win it for the good people?
Well, it's a very good question what culture war covers. I've listened to Douglas Murray talking about this recently, and he said something, I thought there was something in which he just said, it's maybe just time to move on and ignore it and think, what would I be doing if I wasn't, endlessly arguing that, about what is a woman. I do think possibly the trans thing, although every time you think it's over, there's a new outrage. But I think possibly the tide has turned on that. The great mass of people who had assumed previously that all you had to say was, oh, just be kind, live and let live, have realised that there's something more sinister going on there. But, of course, the long march through the institutions, which took place under Tony Blair, has arguably reached the gift shop now. And there is it's a done deal. And all our academic institutions certainly just seem to be completely riddled with a certain amount of programming now. And I don't know whether that can be reversed. So I think probably it does reflect the changing demographics, specifically by ethnicity, in the West generally, in Britain and in America and in France and so on. We have all grown up and lived under a predominantly white and arguably even, Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture, or, obviously America's had strong Jewish influence throughout my life, and Catholics, are on the Supreme Court and so on, but it's been quite a European, Eurocentric culture, and that is changing. Whether I feel happy, I mean, I'm sure I would have loved to just carried on living as top race forever, but it's not going to be the case. And I think some of what we're seeing are kind of spasms of, not entirely coherent or rational, but understandable attempts to not only assert parity now, but to retroactively assert contributions in the past. I kind of get that, if I'm honest. I think if I were a member of, if I was a member of a group that was becoming more powerful, one of the things I would want to do would be to say, and by the way, we were writing good books in the 19th century too. It wasn't just you lot who were focused endlessly on your own output. So we might just have to adapt to that reality to some extent. But I think to say it's a transitional moment is not necessarily, a value-free judgment, but it doesn't mean that you're going to keep on transitioning forever. I think there might be some stability will emerge at some point, and I just hope that we can, as I say, the one thing I do feel, always is that it's such a different experience when you confront stories on Twitter or on screen or even in like large-scale debates or whatever, compared to what happens when you speak to people face to face. I hardly ever meet anyone in person that I find problematic on that front. There's a handful of people who are obviously, committed to rabble-rousing and creating friction, but the great mass of people sort of do want to get on with their lives, and you can get a very distorted view of it if you're not careful and start to slip into despair if you get too much of your information online and not enough in the real world.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that lately. People saying, well, Twitter, we all know the thing, Twitter's not the real world. But then I heard someone say recently, actually, the real world's now been so influenced by it that it is now becoming the real world. But maybe not. It's not. I'm not sure on that. But I like interesting take on the culture war. Very, very much spoken like a Brighton dwelling liberal, because sorry, it's just a note. But you're much more. I don't know about sanguine, but you're much more sort of. I see it more as like, we need to win this culture war, crush our enemy completely. You're much more like, well, I get their point.
I think if I felt that were an option, and if I felt I had the courage to take that fight, I can see the appeal of it, certainly. And I think there are certain points which are expressed online, as I say, with which I have no truck at all. But I suppose I just don't. It's a little bit like, you go the war in Ukraine. Okay, Russia invaded. There's no question about that. Therefore, is there any settlement outside of Russia just acknowledging the borders that existed before, the invasion, or perhaps before 2014, that wouldn't amount to capitulation? And then there's another argument that, would it perhaps be best to minimize blood loss and death toll now, and to minimize the possibility for escalation into a nuclear conflict by making certain amount of concessions? Who knows? It's a question of reading that situation with greater detail and expertise than I probably have. But you know what I mean. There has to come a point in every conflict where you kind of go, we're not going to win all the territory back that we lost since 1965,
Yeah, okay. Well, I have to say, it was interesting to hear that sort of macro view, because on the micro, you're always very sound, in my opinion, when we're on headliners, if it's a trans issue or something like that, you always,
Yeah.
And you won't have any truck with kind of lefty nonsense of, you always sort of like, no, sorry, Josh, look at this again. It's usually Josh that you're shouting at, saying, look at the facts. Or that time that me and you both pincer movement on Ian Stone about Kyle Rittenhouse, and you were just like, no, I'm sorry, Ian, that's completely wrong. So I found you very sort of staunch on those things.
That was interesting, because that was a specific case where there had been terrible misreporting and people had misunderstood the situation, and they'd swallowed a load of lies, and they were deliberate lies. I think if you pull back from that situation and then say, however, would some slightly more updated legislation as regards gun ownership in America, well, I would probably be in favour of that, to be honest. I'm not an NRA kind of guy, do you know what I mean? But I do think the British don't understand all the complexity of gun ownership in America, but equally I do think that they could conceivably revisit their Second Amendment with a view to minimising the availability of assault weapons to lunatics.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. You see, because your ostensibly often seems sort of like on the right and on GB or something like that, and then a bit more nuanced. Turns out, you just get more and more liberal, or more and more lefty the more we look into it. And it's interesting. You're a complicated person. You're out, like the comedians we talked about. Is a complicated outsider rebel figure. So I suppose you don't want to be pinned into any box particularly, do you?
I do think when you are a stand-up comedian, when you're actually on stage, you usually do have to present slightly more cartoonishly, thick black felt lines around your character, your persona, so that people understand where you are. And then in terms of nuance, the way you do that is by revealing the flaws in your argument or position, but as if unknowingly. Do you know what I mean? Unwillingly, unwittingly. I think in a conversation like this, I'm more inclined to admit to doubt and ambiguity and the possibility that I fail to properly weigh up all the considerations. But on stage, it's simply funny to be preposterously confident about your point of view, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's.
All right. Well, I've taken up over an hour of your time, Simon. So maybe we'll end on that. I've asked my big questions about how we save the country and the culture. Where can people
fail to answer them?
Yeah, well, you've answered them in an annoyingly kind of nuanced way, but I was hoping for something much more like, "This is how Nick," and just get your sword out of your Deus Vult. Yeah. But where can we find it?
I mean, I do love all that stuff, all those online kind of, the chivalry guild type stuff. I love it. I love the aesthetics of it. But, I know that isn't going to be me, so I have to be, be realistic.
Be yourself. It's got to be me. What do you think? So what's your Twitter? It's Simon...
The Simon Evans.
The Simon Evans. So make sure you go on Simon's Twitter. And where else would you like to direct people, Simon? Do you have a show out or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I'll be touring in as of 2 weeks from now, and I'm still working that up from the project that was in Edinburgh. And if you go to thesimonevans.com, that's my website, and you'll find all the dates on there as well. So it would be lovely to see you. And that tour will carry on into the spring as well. But those dates at the moment, just for the autumn, a lot of them in the southwest, a couple in the Midlands. Probably get up into the north. I've only literally just stopped touring the work of the devil 3 months ago, and that was nearly 4 years, obviously interrupted by COVID. So It's kind of crazy, but yeah, it's a never-ending tour, like Bob Dylan. Well, without that, I go broke.
Yeah, is that available on any format? Work of the devil, like on Amazon?
I haven't. I mean, I've got a recording I've made myself, but I don't think it's going to be good enough to be released. But I would love to get a proper show done, and I am hoping that will happen. I don't feel it's like time specific, so it could still happen. But yeah, haven't got it as yet.
Okay, because that's always my disappointment with these Edinburgh shows. You write them, and then we don't, but they're lost.
Yeah, and there was a period, of course, when you could make a living selling DVDs, but nobody pays for it now. So unless you're somebody that Netflix want to put on, it seems to be difficult to monetize that and make it work. But hopefully I will I will get together with somebody and make something available. There is a DVD available, or you can get it as an Audible, I think, or buy it on Amazon. But that's from nearly 10 years ago now. It's a good one.
Yeah, I have it. That's the sort of best of your stand-up.
Yeah, it was. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting to watch now with hindsight.
Yeah. So watch that, but go to Simon's website, go and see him on tour, and follow him on Twitter if you're not already for some crazy reason. And
on Headliners.
On Headliners, yeah. Well, I'll probably see you soon at work. Yeah, Headliners, how could I forget, every night, 11 p.m. And you do Monday and Tuesday, don't you, as host?
As a rule, yes. I find that the easiest way to plan my life out. Martin, the producer, loves to throw me a curveball if he can, but generally speaking, yeah.
Yeah, well, if they listen to this podcast, they probably watch already, but Headliners, 11 p.m, GB News, you'll see probably me and Simon combined in a powerful combination. But anyway, pinch being a lefty, and then on reflection, thinking it's more nuanced. All right, thanks, mate.
Thank you very much.
All right, that was Simon. Fascinating as ever, I thought. Hope you agree. If you're watching on YouTube, give us a subscribe, give us a like. If you're listening on audio, why not leave a 5-star review? And thanks for all your reviews so far. I really appreciate them, especially the ones that are very glowing about me. And if you want to support the show, go to buymeacoffee.com/Nick Dixon. You'll notice we don't do adverts anymore because I don't really want to interrupt the flow, but it does cost money to do the show. So if you want to support us, buymeacoffee.com/Nick Dixon. Leave a comment. I read them all and I'll reply. And we'll see you again next week.